Today, we will discuss an ethical theory called the natural law theory, and our philosopher for today is Saint Thomas Aquinas. There are several proponents of this natural law, but in this discussion, we will only focus on the view of Saint Thomas Aquinas. So, who is Saint Thomas Aquinas? Aquinas was born in the year 1225 in Roccasecca, Italy. Saint Thomas Aquinas was from a rich and powerful noble family, and as was the custom of the noble families in that time, the younger son was always set to take a religious career. So, while Aquinas' brothers took the military path, his family intended him to join the religious order and follow in his uncle's footsteps, who was an abbot of the Benedictine monastery. At the age of 5, the young Thomas began his education with the monks until he was 13. He then returned to his home and continued his studies in the University of Naples. At the age of 19, Aquinas decided to join the newly formed Dominican order. His family was happy with this decision of Thomas, most especially his mother, because they wanted him to join the order of Saint Benedict, just like his uncle, and of course, for nobles, it was what's expected of them. When his mother learned that Thomas will travel to Rome, she instructed her other sons to kidnap him and bring him back to the castle. Thomas was detained in their castle for almost a year, and all the time, his family did their best to convince him not to join the Dominican order. But Thomas's decision was final, and he will not change his mind. Eventually, his mother conceded, and she arranged for him to escape because, in the social norms of that time, especially for the nobility, his so-called escape would save the dignity of their family rather than openly giving up her son to the Dominican order. Saint Thomas Aquinas really became part of the Dominican order under the tutelage of Saint Albert the Great. So why is Saint Thomas Aquinas a significant thinker that we should study his work? During the medieval period, people found it difficult to understand how faith and reason could exist together. In fact, even now, a lot of people still cannot reasonably explain why they believe in God or why they should do acts like loving your neighbor or helping the poor and avoid doing bad things like lying, stealing, or murder. Most likely, if asked, why should you not steal? Or why should you not commit adultery? Or why should you give money to charity? The answer would be because it is a God's command. But Aquinas was not satisfied with this kind of answer. He believed that people can have faith and reason, and that this knowledge was from God. So you should use your reason to understand your faith rather than simply saying, because God said so. His best known works are Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologica. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas explained the Catholic religion and defended it against opposing points of other doctrines. On the other hand, the Summa Theologica, which is considered to be one of the most influential Western literary work, is famous for its arguments in proving the existence of God using reason alone. So, what is this natural law of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is our concern for today? First of all, natural law does not refer to the law of nature that science describes. Natural law is an ethical and philosophical theory proposing that humans possess intrinsic values that govern our reasoning and behavior. This means that as people, we already know within us what is right and what is wrong, without being told so by external sources like religion, society, the government, or the courts of law. In fact, Aquinas said that human laws must follow the natural law if we are to create a just society. So go back to the question, what is St. Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory? According to St. Thomas Aquinas, if we act in keeping with reason, then we are partaking in the natural law. What does this mean? Aquinas believed that everything follows a plan, that everything has a purpose. And this view is anchored on Aristotle's concept of telos, which is a Greek word for purpose, goal, or the true final function of an object. Thinkers who propose that everything has a true final function are called teleologists. So for teleologists, the seed has a telos of growing into a plant or a tree. The telos of the nose is for breathing, your eyes for seeing, and so on and so forth. Aquinas believed that if such object, and by object he meant both living and non-living things, like humans, non-living things like chairs, computer, and there are also physical and the non-physical things. Basically, the term object talks about everything that you can think of. In philosophy, we call that as being. So according to Aquinas, if such object follows its purpose, then such object is good. A seed that become a tree or plant that it was supposed to grow is a good seed. If you are breathing right now through your nose, then your nose is a good nose. But what about people? A good person is someone who is what? What is your purpose? So that we can be called a good person. For Aquinas, the answer for this is reason. People have the capacity to reason so that we can make choices in an ethical way. He argued that reason is what makes a person unique compared to other creatures like dogs or things like rocks. And if people act according to reason, then we will come to see that there are absolute rules that bind all things together at all times. In Aquinas' view, a good person is a person who acts according to reason. Now, isn't that revolutionary? Considering he is a priest, a monk, and he says that a person must act according to reason instead of saying that we should act according to God's laws. So where does God figure in all this? What is God's role in morality? This is where Aquinas' natural law theory comes in. According to Aquinas, God's commands are there to help us see what is right and what is wrong, rather than figure out or determine right and wrong. His natural law theory has four different types: the eternal law, the natural law, the human positive law, and the divine law. To understand what St. Thomas meant by God's commands are there to help us see what is right and wrong rather than figure out right and wrong, we need to understand his four different laws and how each law is related to the other. First and foremost, among Aquinas' laws is the eternal law. According to Aquinas, the eternal law is God's rational purpose and plan for all things, and that the eternal law has always been a part of God. And since God has no beginning and no end, the eternal law has always existed. It is not something that God suddenly thought of at some point and then he commanded us to follow it. Eternal law has always been there. So, if eternal law has always been there, what are these laws? How are we to know that these laws are? And that's where St. Thomas' second law comes in, the natural law. According to Thomas Aquinas, people have the capacity to reason. Therefore, deep inside or intrinsically, we already know if something is good or bad. And we do not need to check any law book to make sure it is. For example, your biology class will tell you that all living things will protect its life and do what it can to survive. Therefore, staying alive is good. But you could ask, if staying alive is good, is dying bad? Well, based on natural law, no. Dying is not bad if death is part of the natural process. In fact, in biology, a dead organism helps other organisms live. So, death is good if it is part of the natural process. But if it is murder, you do not need anyone telling you that killing another living being is bad. It could be killing an animal, and more so, killing another person, especially if the reason for killing is merely to kill. Instinctively, we know that this is bad because all living things are wired to preserve life. So when Thomas Aquinas talked about natural law, he was talking about internal rules that we intrinsically recognize and not the external rules that tell us what to do. Natural law are not rules that are written down so we can consult it if we wanted to know that we are doing something right or something wrong. People do not need to learn what we should pursue, good, and avoid evil, because we already know that is what we should do. St. Thomas Aquinas argued that people will inherently pursue good and avoid evil. And with that, he gave a list of primary precepts or the absolute rules that bind all things together at all times. And why do we instinctively know these rules? We know these rules because these precepts are God's and everything comes from God. And this is why all his creatures also instinctively follow these rules. So what are these primary precepts? According to Thomas Aquinas, the primary precepts are, first, to protect and preserve life. Second, to reproduce. Third, to educate the young. Fourth, to know and worship God. Five, to live in society in a harmonious way. Avoid offending others and shun ignorance. The first three primary precepts are true to all living beings in all instances at all times. These precepts are pretty straightforward and easy to understand, and basically all three simply means to survive. Every living being will do everything it can to stay alive, and every living being will instinctively reproduce, either sexually or asexually, so that its species will continue, which is all about preserving life. Also, every living being will teach its young, like how to find food, how to fly, how to swim. Basically, the parents teach their young how to survive. The remaining four precepts apply mainly for human beings because, according to Aquinas, it is due to the uniqueness of how God created us. But even though these four precepts mainly apply to humans, you will also come to understand that these four precepts are still related to the first precept, shared by all living things, which is to protect and preserve life. The fourth precept is knowing and worshiping God. History will show how humans have always had a relationship with the divine, but we can never point out a single source as to who taught humans about the concept of the divine. Through generations, humans have always just sought and worshiped God based on their understanding of God in their particular place and time. The fifth precept is to live in society. This pertains to the fact that people are also social animals. We flourish when we are part of a group. And since we need to be part of a group, we also instinctively cooperate, which brings us to the sixth precept: avoid offending others. Because we know if we do not cooperate with others, our chances for survival also lessens. The seventh precept, shunning ignorance, is similar in a sense with the precept of educating the young, as both promotes survival. However, shunning ignorance is uniquely human because God created us with the ability to reason. Human beings instinctively want to learn things. We are natural knowers. And we do not simply learn the what. We also want to know the why, the when, the where, and the how of things. It is worth to note, though, that St. Thomas Aquinas' book, The Precepts of Avoid Offending Others and Shun Ignorance, were not plainly presented as precepts as compared to the first five. But rather, these two precepts were explicitly pointed out in his arguments. Okay, so far, we talk about the eternal law, which was always God's plan and has always existed with God, and the natural law that living beings instinctively know and instinctively follow. But it cannot also be denied that there are laws that we obey here on earth. If we do not obey these laws, we get punished. So what are these laws for? And why did humans make them? Aquinas called these laws as human laws, and that these are secondary precepts. Human laws are made because the natural law were too general, and as we need specific rules to guide in our day-to-day activities. However, St. Thomas Aquinas stressed that the secondary precepts must always be aligned with the natural law or the primary precepts. In fact, according to Aquinas, if human laws are not consistent with the natural law, then we should not follow them. Human laws that were created by people through rational reflection are in line with the natural law, and St. Thomas Aquinas called this kind of law as the real good. But as you know, there are several human laws that do not conform with the natural law, and debates about it is non-stop. But let us just take one law for example, legalizing abortion. Several countries have legalized abortion. Even in Italy, where the Vatican is located and majority of the people there are Catholics. In countries where abortion is legal, a woman can terminate her pregnancy within the prescribed period. However, if we follow the natural law theory, abortion is wrong. So, it is immoral to legalize abortion. Aquinas called these human laws that do not follow the natural law as apparent good, or that which merely seems to be good because it satisfies some appetite or desire that it became a choice. But it is not real good because it is not morally right, as it does not conform to the ultimate purpose of the human person as designed by God. According to Aquinas, an apparent good diminishes person's true nature because it takes the person away from God's true purpose. Take note that God is the source of dignity, and we all come from God, so we all possess dignity. Dignity is the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect. Dignity is not something we give. Dignity is part of us because we are created by God, who is the source of dignity. Apparent goods are laws that only satisfy some appetite or desire, and these kinds of laws diminish the person's dignity. St. Thomas Aquinas stressed that it is immoral to follow human law that does not follow the natural law, and it does not follow God's ultimate purpose for us. But then you will wonder, if people instinctively knew and seek to follow the natural law, then why do people constantly not follow the natural law? In other words, why do we keep doing the wrong things instead of the right ones? In St. Thomas' view, the reason for this human behavior is ignorance and emotion. So in the issue of abortion, he would reason that if people would only really think hard, then he will realize abortion is wrong. But then you will say lawmakers have exhaustively debated these laws before approving it as a law. So apparently, they have really thought about it. You have to realize, though, that debating about something does not necessarily mean the issue was discussed primarily based on logic or pure reason. And this is what St. Thomas Aquinas meant when he said to think hard about the kind of human laws to propose. And this is his context of ignorance. It is the lack of knowledge in someone who is capable of knowing. Now, let's talk about the other reason that St. Thomas Aquinas pointed out as to why people do not always follow the natural law. And he said, because of emotion. Emotion was a very important concept to Aquinas, and his presentation of arguments on emotion was so effective that medieval thinkers made his theory as their starting point for their own discussions. Simply put, Aquinas theorized that emotion is an appetitive faculty, which means it is something that moves the body into action in order to satisfy a bodily need, and that such need that demands to be satisfied are merely things of the world. So he also said that emotions precedes judgment of reason, which shows just how powerful emotion can be when it comes to making decisions. However, Aquinas also asserted that humans are not completely helpless in keeping emotions in check when making a decision, or as he puts it, emotions are cognitively penetrable because intellect can influence emotion, meaning we are capable of consciously making changes in our belief or thought by using reason after our initial emotional response. And this, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, is why most often than not, you fail to follow the natural law. You did not use reason in your decision-making process, even though you have the capacity to think, and you allowed your emotion to cloud your judgment. Now, based on our discussion on natural law and the primary and the secondary precepts, you would think that we really do not need God in order to know His eternal will, because we only need to use reason to keep us aligned with what He designed us to be. And this is where the divine law comes in. Remember that God has always had a design for everything. And this design is not something that God just thought of at some point, but rather, this design has always existed with God. God's design is the eternal law. Living things, like humans, take part of the eternal law through the natural law that we are instinctively drawn to follow. And we do not need any external source to tell us that what we are doing is right or wrong. Knowing what is right or wrong is already built within us, and we are constantly drawn to do what is right because that is how God designed us. But since natural law is not very specific, humans came up with specific rules to guide behavior. Because we are unique thinking beings capable of reason, Aquinas called these specific rules as the human law or the human positive law. At this point, it should be clear to you that even though God designed us with a moral compass, humans are not really very good at discovering these primary precepts. And people do not follow the natural law all the time. And several human laws do not follow the natural law. Why? St. Thomas Aquinas argued that reason behind these instances is ignorance and emotion. So, if we keep doing the wrong things because of ignorance and emotion, how does God keep us in the right track so we can fulfill His purpose? According to Aquinas, God in His grace and as He see fit, He will reveal to us His divine law. It cannot be denied that no matter how we try to reflect or use reason in making decisions, we eventually will do wrong one time or another. Therefore, we need guidance to keep us aligned with God's plan. St. Thomas Aquinas called this as a revealed guidance, which comes in the form of divine law. An example of the divine law are the commandments that you find in the Bible. In Aquinas' view, God's divine law are not orders that tells us what is morally acceptable, but rather the divine law will enlighten us of what is in fact moral in the very first place. In such manner, we are always in the right track for His design for us. For example, you are a government official and you know that as government official, you can find legal loopholes that can allow you to make money through government projects. However, deep inside you, you also know that this is a form of stealing because the money used to fund government projects are actually not yours. However, you can still argue that the money that you will get out of this government project will help your poor constituents because you will always get solicitation letters from your constituents asking money for their basketball courts or pay for their hospital bill or pay for the funeral of their family members. So it can't be wrong for you to get money out of this government project and help your constituents because you could say that God did tell us to help the poor. So as a government official, should you manipulate the law to get money from the government project to fund the financial needs of your constituents? But then, what did God say in His commandments? God said, do not steal. So the dilemma of should you or should you not use government money for personal purposes, which is basically stealing, your dilemma actually came from knowing within you through your built-in moral compass that stealing is wrong and you should not do it even though you can legally get away with it. And God's commandments are there to remind you of what you already know in the very first place. The point of the situation I presented is simple. There are instances that our reasoning is convoluted and confused. And because of this, we need someone to remind us of what God really wants us to do. And who is the better person to remind us of what God really wants us to do? Well, this person is no other than God Himself. And these reminders are precisely what is revealed to us in the divine law. This is what he meant that the divine law are not orders telling us what is morally acceptable, but rather the divine law enlightens us what is, in fact, moral in the very first place. We need God to remind us to keep us in the right track as He intended for us. And with that, you get the basic idea of the natural law, theory, by St. Thomas Aquinas. His concept of eternal law, natural law, human law, and the divine law, and hopefully, at the very least, St. Thomas's concepts made you curious to know more on how you can live a moral life and fulfill your purpose as God designed you to be. By the way, earlier I pointed out that St. Thomas Aquinas said human laws must follow the natural law if we are to create a just society. Based on what you understand of this discussion on the natural law theory of St. Thomas, what did he mean by this? Please reflect on it. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so that you will be updated with our upcoming lectures.